Welcome to the Right Advice with Randy and Amber. I'm Randy.
And I'm Amber. Today we are going to give you our top 10 favorite and, in our opinion, best high fantasy and low fantasy movies of all time. High fantasy is a story that takes place in a unique world totally built by the writer. A low fantasy takes place in something that we would see as resembling Earth in the past, but assuming that certain magical elements were real. So for instance, Greek mythology, assuming all the Greek gods are real. So Hercules would be considered a low fantasy. We're going to exclude hidden worlds, which would be something like the Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter, because the real world does exist and they are transported to another world. So both the worlds exist. So you get it? High fantasy, low fantasy, and let's start with number 10.
Okay, so I'm going to focus more on the older movies, older fantasy movies. And at number 10, I'm going to put in The Golden Voyage of SINBAD. So that is a low fantasy because it's based on Middle Eastern Arabian mythology, and that is one of the things that's so great about it is, so Sinbad is hired to take the prince, because there's always like the prince or the princess, to a mystical island so that he can be transformed back to his normal self. So simple quest, they go, we have a bad guy played by Tom Baker, one of the Doctor Who's, my favorite Doctor Who, and he is a evil sorceress, does a great job of it, so there's tons of stop motion animation, which just makes that kind of a movie great, and a lot of fight scenes with these animated creatures, and overall just, I mean, really a fun movie to watch.
Yeah, I loved it growing up. It was one of those movies that was on late at night, I guess because it wasn't popular at the time that I was younger, but I still loved it. So lots of good memories being terrified of, the stop motion is scary when you're a kid. All right, number 9. So I'm doing newer movies, but I'm starting with an older movie, but it came out after I was born, so it counts, and that is Legend, starring Tom Cruise, Mia Sara, and the amazing Tim Curry. And I just think it is such a beautiful film. It was originally it's directed by Ridley Scott, who did Gladiator. He was an art director, so he really went all out, took it very seriously. It wasn't, in his mind, one of those cheesy 1980s fantasies made for teens, like, The Neverending Story and Labyrinth. He took it seriously. The original script was actually all in poetry, and you can kind of feel that as you watch the characters interact. And I just have to say, Tim Curry is amazing, and it is the best representation of the devil, so he's darkness, that I've ever seen. He just has these enormous horns, and he's so dynamic. I mean, he can be very dark and mysterious, and then he can be, raging like this bull, and then, trying to be seductive, and it's an interesting role for sure. So I liked it.
Tim Curry is an undervalued actor. He is excellent, and
I don't undervalue him. I love him.
And neither do I. I mean, he's excellent. This is maybe his finest role that he's done. He does a lot of voice work now because he has a really rich voice, and he can do a lot with it. He can change that around, like you said, very, very adaptable. So in my mind, the biggest draw for that movie is Tim Curry. Although I do like the very fey feel to the world that they depict.
Yeah, it has a very specific fairy tale feel, and the unicorns, goblins, and fairies, and the way that you would have imagined people in medieval times would have imagined them to be. I really liked the character Gump, which I thought was interesting too. So, very beautiful film. If you haven't seen it, check it out.
A very ethereal look to the whole thing, which goes with the whole fae concept. So yeah, excellent movie. All right, that brings me up to number 8. Let me look at my list real quick. That is Clash of the Titans, and I'm talking about the 1980 version of it, which I feel is far superior. And of course, this is a low fantasy because it's based on Perseus and his quest, being guided by the gods and opposed by the gods, and eventually to take care of the Kraken. I mean, the Kraken comes in and he kills the Kraken, he kills the Medusa. I mean, he's really excellent. And I love that the deities were actors of renown at that time. They pulled in some of the big actors for that time period to play the gods, and it's really a pleasure to watch them interact. And a ton of action, just very fun.
So something that's funny about that movie, and I believe this is one I saw a lot as a kid. I loved the mechanical owl, by the way. That mechanical owl was on my Christmas wish list maybe a dozen times. I, for some reason, would watch Superman with Christopher Reeves around the same time that I was watching Clash of the Titans. And for some reason, I thought that they came from the same universe. I thought that Superman came from the gods, you know, when they're in their little cloud palace. So yeah, that's the weird things that were going on in my head as a child. Other than that, I was just terrified of Medusa. So
I'm imagining Superman now going through that adventure, and how would he fare up against the Medusa? Could he beat the Medusa? Kraken, no problem, right?
Yeah.
Because he's got the strength and invulnerability, but Medusa can just turn you to stone with a look.
But he's got laser eyes.
I don't know. My money's on the Medusa on that fight. But yeah, the owl, definitely. And it reminds me of an old adage in Hollywood, never co-star with an animal or small children because they steal the show. So
yeah, that owl definitely stole my show. I loved it. All right, we're going to move on now to number 7, and that is, for me, The Fall. This is one I don't believe that you've seen, Randy, but it is filmed by, I can't remember his name, but it's gonna be right there. I think it's called Tierson. It's a one-word name. It is such a beautifully filmed movie. This is a story of a man in a hospital, and this is a kind of like Princess Bride. He's telling a story to a little girl, and we see the story unfold in her mind. The story he's telling isn't all that spectacular. It's exactly what you would think somebody who happens to be sitting next to a little girl who's bored would just make this story up on the spot. But it is shot with all seriousness. I think it was shot in 11 different countries. Very good use of practical effects and color. And the props and the sets and the costumes are just, you'll be blown away. It is a masterpiece of visual art. So it's a bit on the arty side. I usually like to focus on making sure there really is a good story, but I think it did a great job of being what it was supposed to be, which is a story being told to a little girl on the spot in a hospital. It is
nice.
How she imagines it. So I appreciated that as an art film, and just as sticking to what it was supposed to be and being taken seriously.
Okay, number 6 is KRULL. And, you know, I'm going to just say right away, a lot of the acting is cheesy, right? But it really has a high fantasy feel to it. And it's actually kind of a cross between fantasy and sci-fi, because it deals with an alien invading the planet and it's going to take over the universe. And the princess is taken, the prince has to go rescue the princess from the alien, which they call the beast. But, you know, the vast majority of it is very fantasy, magic and magical creatures like a cyclops and a changeling. I mean, so all of these things make it feel much more like a fantasy than they do science fiction. And yes, very cheesy, but a great storyline, very, in my mind, very interesting, and some great interaction considering how cheesy some of the lines are, mostly from the prince and the princess. But scenes with the cyclops and the magician and the young boy all have some really good emotional strength to them, very touching.
Yeah, that was the thing that I remembered about it the most. And I've only seen it a couple of times, and the first time I think I was in middle school, so it was a late time for me to see it, because I saw most of these when I was little. And I remember being really affected by the fate of the Cyclops. I mean, that was so tragic. Even as a teenager, I mean, where this is a dated movie for me as a teenager, I still felt an emotion because of what happened to the Cyclops. If you don't know what we're talking about, go check out the film. It is sad.
Okay. I was actually going to talk about the Cyclops a little bit. I mean, so one of the things, if you want to have a really successful high fantasy, you need to be able to develop your own world and world mythology, and the Cyclops on this one does. So the story behind the Cyclops, or as a race, they made a deal with a powerful being to be able to see into the future, but they had to give one of their eyes up for that. But they were tricked, so the only thing that they can see in the future is the time of their own death. I mean, so that's the kind of detail to a high fantasy that really makes it stand out. And those kinds of elements in this movie are what puts it so high on my list of top fantasy movies.
All right, moving up for me to number 5. Now, for me, the top 3 that remain for me, I have to say, could be interchangeable. I've tried to order them as best I can, but for number 5, I decided is Princess Mononoke. And this is one that you haven't seen. It is an animated film by Hayao Miyazaki, who is basically the Walt Disney of Japan, but his films are a bit more arty, and this might be one of his more adult movies. I just think it's one of the most perfectly written stories. The main character, it starts with action immediately. You are immediately immersed in what the main plot is, which is a prince who's protecting his village gets cursed by a demon, and he now is expelled from his village and goes on a quest to find the source of this evil, what has happened. And he's dying, so through the whole film he knows he's dying, but he's been gifted with superhuman strength now because of this curse. So he's super strong, but he's dying, and he's going to do something meaningful with his life. A lot of people look at this movie as being a representation of civilized man versus nature, like, oh, you know, eventually nature is going to win. And there's a little bit of that, but I think that the bigger hidden message is that there's good and bad in everything. Humanity has a lot of terrible corruption, but also we're the only thing capable of mercy. So I like that. Nature is beautiful and clean and should be preserved, but it's brutal and there is no mercy. So I enjoyed every aspect of that movie. I still do. It's actually a family favorite that we put on every once in a while. And I recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it. A little bit scary for younger kids, but if they've seen something like all of the Harry Potter movies, it should be fine. Just expect that this is an animation where people get shot and have blood, and that's shocking for people. Oh, and also a decapitation or two, but no blood in those, which is
But the
weird.
kids will be fine with that. That's okay. The kids can watch that.
It's the thing. I feel like it works because there's no blood. Like if it was decapitation and blood flying everywhere, I'd say no, not for kids. But it's weird. Like they get shot and they bleed, but they get decapitated and don't bleed. Anyway.
Just remind me not to let you watch any of my grandchildren. Okay, so I'm just. I love how Amber has a lot more esoterical views on the movies and her picks. Not me. I like a really simple. I don't know, the prince or the princess got taken. We just have to go get them back, and we're going to kill a ton of things along the way. So that, you know, my picks generally tend to reflect that kind of a storyline.
And there's nothing wrong with that. If your focus is something that's pure, I say go for it. Really go all out and showcase what your main theme is, what your main moral is, what your main goal is, or the growth of the character. Whatever it is that you're focusing on, go for it. It can be a simple story, but dedicate yourself to it. Really commit to doing your absolute best. And
Right.
the movies that you're talking about, they do. I mean, there's nothing harder than, I think claymation is the hardest form, the highest form of animation. It's the most difficult to produce. And that's what stop motion is, essentially. It is a type of claymation, stop motion. So,
All right, so number 4.
yes,
And this is going to be a surprise that I picked it.
I like
It's
this one too.
The Princess Bride.
Yep.
And so that will be, you know, we don't know. No, it's low fantasy because there are enough comments in it to point out that it is our world, but it is fantasy because we have giants and we have other magical things that show up. So it is a fantasy. And here again, simple storyline. So we have a character. His girlfriend is stolen by the dread pirate Roberts.
Or no, it's the princess is kidnapped, and suddenly
Princess Buttercup.
The dread pirate Roberts has showed up to kidnap the kidnapped princess. All the while, this very evil Prince Humperdinck is chasing them down, and it's a great cast of characters. I just love the characters in that movie.
The characters are great. There's a lot of humor in there.
So much.
Billy Crystal's in there, and Miracle Max. What a great character. Andre the Giant plays the giant in it.
Oh, he's so
Excellent,
cute.
Alex. Excellent. I mean, so all these characters are very amusing, great writing, and an excellent sword fight scene.
Yeah, so I have a background in fencing, and every fencer that I know adores the fencing scene in this movie because it's thrilling, and it's not the most amazing choreography, but overall it achieves what you should try to do with a fencing scene, which is escalate. So it starts out with them just going back and forth a little bit, little banter happening here and there. Then they start, climbing up on the rocks, things get a bit more dangerous, and going up the stairs. Next thing you know, the main good guy, or we think that he's the good guy, and the Dread Pirate Roberts is actually a good guy too. He says, "Wait, I've got to tell you something. I am not left-handed," and then he switches to his right. And then later on, a switch happens again. So Dread Pirate Roberts is getting his butt kicked, and then suddenly he's like, "I gotta tell you something too. I'm not left-handed either." And he switches to his right hand. And it's just so good. It is so funny, and they do what you should always do in writing, which is increase the stakes.
Right, and that is a beautiful, beautiful example of it. I mean, it's a sword fight scene we've seen. I mean, I've seen thousands of them, right?
Yeah, me too.
But this one stands out because you're going, and as far as sword fight scenes go, this is interesting, right? But then they up the stakes, and then they up the stakes again, right? And it's amusing because they use the whole "I'm not left-handed" twice. It mirrors and it adds a comedic element to it. I mean, so it just really makes that whole scene super memorable.
Yeah, and like I said, it is a classic even among people who can see that it's theatrical fencing. They say this is still fun and exciting. All right, so moving on to our number 3. Okay, my number 3 is one that most people I think will be familiar with, and you will be too, is Sleeping Beauty by Walt Disney. This movie is a work of art. I was actually debating between my favorite fantasy story, which is Beauty and the Beast, and then Sleeping Beauty, but I have to just say Sleeping Beauty wins as far as overall production. If you ever get the chance to see it in letterbox as it was meant to be seen, really admire that artwork. It is so well stylized, and I can't find anything about that movie that sticks out to me as being not perfect. It is so well done. The music choice even is fantastic. They had Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty score underneath everything, and the musical numbers come from Tchaikovsky. It's just brilliant. I think that this is Disney's greatest animation of all time, and I don't think there are many people who will debate that.
So yeah, simple storyline, high fantasy, it's a great example of the genre.
Yeah, and the classic tale still sells. I mean, I showed some other movies to a friend of mine who'd never seen them, and I said, "These are old stories." And he said, "That was really good though." And he said, "Yeah, you got to keep in mind that something that is really true and gets to a core ideal or a core element of humanity, if you can really find that and focus hard on it, it will hold up for a long time. People will still enjoy it."
Yeah, there's a ton of stories that I know about that are kind of copies of that, right? So it's kind of like Sleeping Beauty in space, Sleeping Beauty in Manhattan. They just kind of change the particulars around. They stay to the same story because it works. It resonates with audiences.
All right, moving on to number 2.
Okay. Gosh, I love this movie, and a lot of people might disagree with me, but Jason and the Argonauts. And, not slow fantasy, but it's got that simple storyline that Jason and his crew have to go get the Golden Fleece. I mean, so it's very simple, right? But for me, what kind of really... also, it kind of looks like bad dubbing when some of the actors talk, so that's not great. But it's got Ray Harryhausen doing the animation, right? And so for that day, that was the most state-of-the-art special effects that you could get in a movie. And Ray Harryhausen, he was the best at it. And so we got all sorts of really great. There's the scene with the harpies. There's the scene with the Hydra. And then at the end, the scene with the skeletons. Oh, I love that scene.
That is a classic scene in cinema history. People were blown away by those dancing skeletons, or the fighting skeletons. I'm mixing them up also with the cartoon.
And you'll see that clip a lot on when people are doing shows about whether fantasy stories or whatever else. You will see that clip come up and up. And I can tell a personal story about that. So this has been just, oh my gosh, I love this movie, and I have for years. So when I was younger, and embarrassingly, I mean, like when I was like 10 and should know better, but I would watch that, and then the scene would come up where Hercules is going to go in and he's going to steal the treasure of the gods. And because I'd already seen it before, I knew that Talos is going to animate and he's going to come after everyone. And so I would watch, and I'd hide behind a chair, and I'd peek out from behind the chair, and I'd be like, no, Hercules, no, don't do that. And you know what? Every single time Hercules did that, and Talos came after him, and it was just amazing. So I totally love that movie.
For me, it was one of those movies that I saw late at night, and I do probably mix it up quite a bit with Clash of the Titans. As you know, it's got that same look to it, and I wouldn't say KRULL, but it definitely with Clash of the Titans. There's something about those movies that is mesmerizing, and I think it's because you can tell that they really put their all into it. There are very few movies before the 90s that you couldn't see that there was some effort in there. I mean, this was one of them. This was a big epic tale. Jason and the Argonauts and the quest to find the Golden Fleece. When the people who are making it love it, you can see it, and you will most likely love it too.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to our number one pick. But before we tell you what our number one is, we have a bonus that we are going to be telling you after this one. It is the one that we have a very difficult time ranking because, in our opinion, it is a standalone as one of the most underrated, greatest, very difficult to find anything to complain about films. But for our number one slot, and it may be obvious, The Lord of the Rings by Peter Jackson. Well, it's Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but it is his interpretation of The Lord of the Rings. It is just beautiful, and he did exactly what I was talking about with Jason and the Argonauts. He took it seriously, and he was dedicated to telling Tolkien's story or portraying Tolkien's world. Yes, he changed some things, but he had to. I mean, you got to cut out Tom Bombadil. I'm so sorry, but it's not going to work. People aren't going to sit through that.
I'm not sorry. I mean, I love Tolkien, but I could totally read that without Tom Bombadil.
There were some other things that were changed. Arwen's character wasn't in certain scenes, but it was not changed in a way that changed the story or changed the message that Tolkien was really trying to get to. Yeah. And that to me says this is a filmmaker who, if he's allowed to do what he wants, I think he'll try to do his best to please the fans and to respect the material. And I appreciate that a lot. But on its own, beautiful cinematography, beautiful soundtrack. The special effects still hold up. I mean, this is a 25-year-old movie, isn't it now? 20, 25? It's pretty old.
Boy, I feel old. But yeah, it's actually kind of old now.
I actually, the special effects in Lord of the Rings are better than the special effects in The Hobbit and other movies that have come out 20 years later. There's maybe one shot in each movie, usually involving Legolas, that I can roll my eyes at, but everything else is gorgeous. It's hard to find anything to complain about.
Those elves, they're always showboating. You know, that's why I don't like them.
That is their flaw, pride. That's supposed to be that way. He's just proud of his acrobatic prowess and surfing skills, apparently. Yeah, and I love the characters, and I love the theme. It's okay to have a Dark Lord who's just pure evil. You don't have to give them a reason to have been evil. That's actually the point, is that some things are so corrupt and so evil, you cannot fix it, you cannot defeat it, but it will undoubtedly, inevitably destroy itself.
Okay, then our bonus content.
Our bonus movie, which we believe, like I said, cannot be ranked or put on any list, Willow. You know, we've done other videos on Willow. We've got more that are coming up. And it's just so underrated. People look over it and say, oh, it's flawed. I showed it to somebody a week ago who had never seen it. And he said, this was made in the 80s? And I said, yes, this was made in the 80s. And he said, it doesn't look like it was made in the 80s until we got to the Eborsisk, the giant two-headed dragon, where it was clearly very well done stop-motion animation. But the humor holds up, the writing holds up, the cinematography, the music is I listen to that soundtrack by itself. It is one of the most memorable soundtracks you will ever hear. It's so good and so unique because of all these unique instruments that were pulled in from all over the world to give it that totally Willow feel.
Totally. I mean, and the characters, they're so interesting and they work so well. The acting is such a high quality. And, you know, you get lines that you can just repeat over and over. And that's kind of the really, in my mind, the truest sense of how successful a movie is.
Yeah.
If those lines become part of pop culture, mainstream culture, that you use them here or there, because and they originated from that movie, then the writers have done a good job.
Yep, I agree. Thank you for joining us for our top 10 and golden bonus, and we will see you next time.
Later.